Welcome to Glisso English. Real life stories.
Imagine walking down a street you've lived on for 40 years. You know every crack in the sidewalk and every tree in the park. But suddenly, the names of the streets vanish. The houses look like strangers. You are only 3 blocks from home, but you are completely lost. Today, we are diving into a powerful real-life story called The Memory Slip. We'll follow Arthur, a man facing the early stages of dementia, as he uses every bit of his logic and language to find his way back to his blue front door. Stick around until the end because I've prepared a vocabulary quiz in the description and the community section to see how many new phrases you can remember. Let's head out into the neighborhood with Arthur. Let's start the story. Arthur stepped out onto the porch, the cold morning air biting at his skin. He reached down to pick up the newspaper, but his fingers felt heavy and slow. For a moment, he stared at the plastic wrap, wondering why it felt so unfamiliar. He looked up at the street he had walked for 40 years, but something was wrong. The oak tree on the corner looked like a giant hand reaching toward the gray sky. He knew he had painted the front door blue in the summer of 1994, but as he turned around, the blue seemed to vibrate and change into a dull teal. Arthur shook his head, trying to clear the sudden fog that clouded his vision. "I am just tired," he whispered, his voice sounding thin against the wind. He decided to walk to the corner store, a short trip he made every single day. His feet moved automatically, following a rhythm his muscles remembered better than his mind. As he reached the sidewalk, he realized he could not remember the word for sidewalk. He looked at the concrete path and searched his brain for the right English noun. The gray floor, he thought, frustrated by the gap where the word should be. He looked back at his house, but every building now looked like a mirror image of the next. Panic began to rise in his chest like a cold tide, making it hard to breathe. He was standing in the middle of his own life, but the map was gone. Arthur decided to move forward, hoping the movement would shake the shadows from his mind. He walked toward the corner store, a path he had traveled thousands of times before. The air smelled of damp earth and car exhaust, familiar scents that offered no comfort today. He saw a neighbor's dog barking behind a fence, but the animal's name had vanished. "Hello, Barker," Arthur muttered, his tongue feeling thick and clumsy in his mouth. He looked at the street sign at the intersection, but the letters seemed to rearrange themselves. The word maple looked like a jumble of sticks rather than a name he should recognize. He tried to practice his English to stay sharp, naming the objects he passed along the way. "Green fence," he said aloud, then pointed to a mailbox. "Red metal box for letters." The simple exercise felt like a lifeline, a way to anchor himself to the physical world. But then he reached the corner where the bakery used to be, now replaced by a glass cafe. The modern building was too bright, too sharp, and it didn't fit in his mental puzzle. Arthur stopped walking, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked left and then right, but the geometry of the neighborhood had shifted. The tall, reaching things in the park swayed in the wind, mocking his lack of direction. He knew he was close to home, yet he felt as if he were standing in a different country. He reached into his coat pocket, searching for a sign that he still existed in this place. Arthur turned the corner and felt the air grow strangely warm, like a summer afternoon from decades ago. The modern cars parked along the curb seemed to flicker and transform into boxy sedans from the 80s. He saw a flash of bright plastic in a yard, a small yellow pool filled with splashing water. The sound of children laughing echoed off the brick walls, sharp and clear in the morning air. "Lily? David?" he called out, the names of his children surfacing naturally like bubbles in a stream. He followed the phantom sound down a narrow alleyway, his pace quickening with a sudden desperate hope. He stepped over a rusted tricycle that shouldn't have been there, his eyes searching for the source of the joy. For a few seconds, the world was vibrant and saturated, a technicolor dream of a life he once led. He reached the end of the alley, expecting to see his wife standing on a back porch with a pitcher of lemonade. Instead, he found himself facing a tall chain-link fence topped with jagged coils of wire. The laughter died away, replaced by the low rhythmic hum of a distant electrical transformer. The colorful pool was gone, replaced by a pile of discarded wooden pallets and a gray trash bin. Arthur leaned against the cold metal of the fence, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The ghosts of his past had led him into a dead end, leaving him deeper in the maze than before. He tried to remember why he had come this way, but the reason had dissolved along with the children's voices. He looked up at the sky, but even the sun seemed to be shining in the wrong direction now. He was a traveler in a city made of memories, and the borders were starting to close. Arthur stepped out of the alleyway and back onto the main sidewalk, his eyes blinking against the light. A young woman in a bright running jacket stopped in front of him, her expression full of concern. "Are you all right, sir? You look a little lost," she said, her voice soft and melodic. Arthur felt a sharp sting of pride, a reflex from a man who had spent 40 years being the provider. He straightened his back and tried to find the English words to build a wall of normalcy around his fear. "I am fine, thank you," he replied, forcing a polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just taking a walk to see the tall, reaching things," he added, gesturing toward the trees. The woman tilted her head, her brow furrowing as she searched for the meaning behind his strange phrasing. "The oaks? They are beautiful today," she said, though she didn't move away to continue her run. Arthur nodded quickly, his mind working frantically to keep the conversation from falling into a deep hole. He knew he should ask for help, but the thought of admitting defeat felt like disappearing entirely. He used his problem-solving skills to offer a vague pleasantry about the weather, a safe harbor in any language. "It is a good day for a fast walk," he managed, though his hands were shaking inside his deep pockets. The woman hesitated, sensing the hollow space behind his words, but she eventually offered a small wave. "Take care then," she called out, as she began to jog away, her footsteps fading into the distance. Arthur watched her go, realizing he had just pushed away the only hand reaching out to pull him back. He was alone again, standing in a conversation that had left him with more questions than answers. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, stretching the shadows of the buildings into long, dark fingers. This shift in light changed the face of the street, making the familiar corners look sharp and threatening. Arthur reached a major intersection where the traffic pulsed like a heavy mechanical heartbeat. The roar of the engines and the screech of brakes sounded like a physical weight pressing against his ears. He stood on the curb, paralyzed by a sudden glitch in his perception of the world around him. To his left, he saw a shimmering glass tower that seemed to have grown out of the ground overnight. To his right, his mind insisted there should be an old hardware store with a creaky wooden floor. The two images clashed in his head, a battle between the reality of 2026 and the map of 1986. He felt a wave of sensory overload, the smell of burnt rubber and the flash of neon signs making him dizzy. "Stop," he whispered to the world, closing his eyes tightly to block out the confusing static. He tried to count to 10 in English, a trick his doctor had suggested to ground his runaway thoughts. 1, 2, 3, but the numbers began to slip and slide like wet stones in a river. He opened his eyes and saw a sea of strangers rushing past him, their faces blurred by their own hurried lives. None of them noticed the man standing at the edge of time, unable to cross the river of cars. He felt like a ghost, trapped in a future that had moved on without asking for his permission. The internal signal was fading, leaving him with nothing but the cold wind and the noise. He needed to find a place to sit, or the weight of the city would surely pull him under. Arthur found a wooden park bench that felt solid and real beneath his weary hands. He sat down heavily, the weight of the afternoon pressing into his bones like lead. To calm his racing heart, he decided to perform a silent inventory of his own existence. He reached into his coat pockets and pulled out 3 objects, laying them carefully on his knees. First was a heavy brass house key, its edges worn smooth by decades of turning in the same lock. Second was a crumpled receipt from a grocery store, the ink faded and the date unreadable. Finally, he pulled out a small yellowed slip of paper with delicate handwriting scrolled across it. He squinted at the words, trying to translate the elegant loops of the pen into meaning. "Milk, bread, soft butter, and the tea you like," the note whispered from the past. He realized with a jolt that this was a shopping list written by his wife, Margaret. But Margaret had been gone for 2 years, leaving a silence in the house that he could never fill. The realization hit him like a physical blow, a sudden clearing in the fog that revealed a deep valley of grief. He traced the letters of her name at the bottom of the slip, his thumb trembling over the ink. The note was a map of a different kind, a reminder of who he was and who he had loved. He studied the receipt, looking for a store name or an address that might point the way home, but the numbers and letters danced away from him, refusing to stay still long enough to be read. He tucked the treasures back into his pocket, clutching the key as if it were a compass. He was a detective in his own life, piecing together a puzzle where the pieces kept changing shape. Arthur stood up from the bench, driven by a sudden and sharp sense of certainty. He turned down a side street where the air smelled of damp earth and blooming flowers. Ahead, he saw a house with a low stone wall and a thick cluster of yellow rose bushes. "The roses," he whispered, his heart leaping with a relief that felt like a physical warmth. He remembered Margaret planting roses just like these in the spring of their 10th anniversary. He walked up the path, his steps light and confident for the first time since he had left the porch. He didn't notice that the mailbox was a different shape or that the shutters were painted green. He reached for the door handle, expecting it to swing open into the familiar scent of old wood. But the door was locked, and as he fumbled with his brass key, it refused to turn in the cylinder. A woman he did not recognize opened the door, her face a mask of confusion and growing fear. "Can I help you? Who are you looking for?" she asked, her voice sharp and defensive.
Arthur froze, the key still clutched in his hand like a useless piece of scrap metal. He looked past her into a hallway filled with modern art and bright minimalist furniture. There was no coat rack where his jacket belonged, and no rug where the dog used to sleep. I live here," he stammered, the English words failing him as his reality began to crumble. The woman shook her head slowly, her eyes softening with a sudden painful realization. "No, sir, you don't live here. You must be mistaken," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. The realization that he was a trespasser in his own neighborhood hit him like a cold wave. He backed away from the porch, his face burning with a shame that was deeper than his confusion. He had found the roses, but he had lost the house, and now he was truly a stranger.
Arthur retreated from the porch, his face burning with the sting of 1,000 silent apologies. He walked without looking back, his feet finding a path through the gathering dusk. A large stone building appeared through the trees, its windows glowing with a soft amber light. It was the neighborhood library, a place where the air always smelled of dust and quiet thoughts. Arthur pushed through the heavy wooden doors, the sudden silence wrapping around him like a warm blanket. He felt a strange comfort in the rows of books, their spines standing like tall soldiers in the shadows. He walked toward the lobby, his eyes searching for the one thing he knew would stay still. A large map of the city was pinned to the wall, its lines and colors sharp against the white paper. Arthur stood before it, his finger tracing the blue vein of the river and the green patch of the park. He searched for the street names, his lips moving as he whispered the English words to himself. "Maple Street," he said, his voice a low hum in the empty room. And then the corner of Fifth. He was trying to bridge the gap between the paper world and the slipping reality outside the doors. The librarian watched him from her desk, her eyes kind and patient as he studied the map. For a moment, the fog in his mind cleared, revealing a single shining path through the maze. He saw the intersection where the bakery had been and the long stretch of sidewalk leading home. He committed the lines to his memory, holding them tight like a secret he was afraid to share. He turned toward the exit, his heart beating with a new and fragile sense of purpose. He was a traveler who had found his compass, even if the stars were starting to fade. Arthur stepped out of the library and into the deep velvet blue of the approaching night. The streetlights flickered to life one by one, casting long orange pools of light onto the pavement. He felt a sudden sharp chill in the air that made his breath bloom in small white clouds. In the distance, past the rows of darkened houses, he saw a tiny flash of familiar blue. "The door," he whispered, his heart hammering against his ribs like a drum in an empty room. He began to walk, his pace quickening into a hurried rhythmic shuffle that bordered on a run. He ignored the confusing neon signs and the blurring faces of the evening commuters. To keep the world from shifting again, he began to speak a single string of English words. "Home, bed, safe, key," he muttered, repeating the sequence over and over like a holy mantra. Each word was an anchor, a heavy weight dropped into the shifting sands of his memory. "Home," he said as he passed the park. "Bed," he added as he crossed the final intersection. The safe was the sidewalk beneath his feet, and the key was the cold metal in his pocket. The blue door grew larger and more solid with every step, a lighthouse in a sea of gray fog.
He didn't look at the trees or the neighbors' windows, afraid that a single glance would break the spell. He reached the edge of his own lawn, the grass crunching softly under his heavy shoes. The porch light was on, casting a warm, welcoming glow over the painted wooden boards. He stood at the base of the steps, his chest heaving as he fought for a steady breath. The maze was behind him, and the destination was finally within his trembling reach. He was a survivor of a journey that had lasted a lifetime in a single afternoon.
Arthur reached the top step and pulled the heavy brass key from his deep coat pocket. The metal was cold, but it slid into the lock with a familiar mechanical click. He turned his wrist and the blue door swung open into the warm, still air of the hallway. The scent of old wood, dried tea, and Margaret's lavender sachets wrapped around him like a hug. He stepped inside and closed the door, leaning his back against the solid wood for a long minute. The slip began to recede, the terrifying fog of the afternoon melting away in the golden lamplight. He walked into the living room and sat in his high-backed armchair, the leather sighing under his weight. On the side table sat a plain notebook and a black pen, waiting for the day's final report. Arthur picked up the pen, his fingers trembling slightly as he opened to a fresh white page. He needed to capture the details, the tall reaching things and the gray floor before they vanished. "Today I went to the store," he wrote in slow, careful English, "and I found my way back." He knew the fog would return tomorrow, or perhaps the day after, thicker than it was before. But for this moment the map was clear, and the house was filled with a quiet, fragile triumph. He looked at the photo of Margaret on the mantel, her smile a steady anchor in the shifting tides. "I am home," he whispered to the empty room, the words tasting like a prayer answered at last. He closed his eyes and let the silence of 40 years settle over him like a soft, protective blanket. The journey was over, and for tonight, Arthur was exactly where he was supposed to be. The story of Arthur reminds us that our identity is woven into the places we live and the words we use. Even when the map of our mind begins to fade, the heart often remembers the way home. Arthur's journey isn't just about a walk through a neighborhood. It's about the human spirit's refusal to let go of what matters most. Arthur made it home today, but his story shows us how challenging it can be when the world we know starts to shift. It's a powerful reminder to cherish our memories and the people who help us keep them. In this story, we looked at how Arthur used anchor words like home, safe, and key to solve his problems. We also practiced describing disorientation and complex emotions in English. Did you catch the different ways he described the trees and the sidewalk? Now it's your turn to practice. I've posted a vocabulary quiz in the community section and pinned it in the comments below. Go there now to test how much you learned from Arthur's journey. Can you find the correct nouns for the objects he forgot? If you found this story helpful for your English and meaningful for your life, please hit the like button and subscribe for more real-life stories. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story. Goodbye.